Raising capital across borders.
I would like to kick off with a generic question. I spoke about this probably with David first, so maybe you can start giving your perspective. So my question would be, if and how COVID-19 has improved the ability or not to raise capital across the border. Do you remember we talked about COVID-19 and implication and how it for you probably was easier?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can start on this topic. So as you rightly said, COVID was an important change in the landscape, I think. So before 2020, when you would speak to investors in the Silicon Valley, where we are located in San Francisco, they would normally consider companies only when they're in about 50 miles circle because of the opportunity to check in with people in person, obviously. So it was very rare that in specifically in early stage, a lead investor would invest in a company that is not very closely located. That, of course, changed tremendously when COVID hit and suddenly all the meetings had to happen on Zoom anyway. So that for a company like ours opened opportunities to reach out to investors all around the world. And I mentioned that earlier today when I think Steve and I, we spoke. Our lead investor of the 2021 round was actually out of Vancouver, Canada, Relentless Pursuit Partners. I did not meet her in person for 2 years afterwards. So she was a lead investor in our seed round. I've never met her until last year at JP Morgan week. So that was possible now, and it seems to be a scheme. And I see it in many other companies as well that now raise from all around the globe.
So, while we, on our side, we initiated our C-Series fundraising in September 2019. So just before COVID-19, and we had a couple of discussions with strategic VCs and so on and so forth, and we closed the deal in April 2020. So beginning of COVID-19. So, but we have been able to close it. We were obviously, as you just said, exchanging through Zoom, Teams, whatever. It works well, and for us also, it took 2 years before we could meet in person with the different investors that put money in our company. But so, to my point of view, it didn't change so much. Dealing through Zoom, whatever. We raised the money anyway, and we closed it.
Any other experience? Anyone raise after COVID or
before, during, and after? I think what COVID did do, and the reason that people don't tend to raise money cross borders, I think, and people tend to focus on raising within a 50-mile radius of where they are, is because that's easier, right? It's easier in principle because companies think that I have to go and do all of my meetings in person, and that was the rule. Investors wanted you to go, and they want to see the whites of your eyes and see how you cope under pressure as they ask you those difficult questions. So I think we were all convinced that you have to go and sit across a table and pitch to somebody, and that's difficult if you're going to Asia, if you're based in Europe and you're going to America. It takes a long time. It's more difficult. And I think what COVID did is it gave us Zoom, it gave us Microsoft Teams, it taught us all how to say, I think you might be on mute. But it opened up opportunities. You didn't need to be there in person anymore. You could get that pitch done remotely. So I think that's why it promoted and gave people the idea of being able to raise outside of just on their front doorstep.
All right, how about we have Andrew introduce himself, and do you have any experience with pre or post-COVID? Did you feel any difference?
Hi, sorry again I'm late. Andy Glass, CEO of Vivasure Medical. I guess we are an Ireland-based company. I'm an American, and we raised a round primarily driven by U.S. investors, so maybe that's one of the reasons we were invited here today. Our experience, well, we were raising during, into 2021 and 2022, so we had kind of some of the waves of COVID. In fact, the main presentation to our lead U.S. investor 2 days before I was supposed to fly, I came down with COVID. So I had to do that from Zoom into a conference room with my team there, which was very awkward. But it worked out quite well. So I think, obviously, it's changed the dynamics of your interactions, COVID, now that it's more acceptable to do Zoom, Teams calls. But there's still, some of the investors still like to kind of meet and see, and they want to touch the product and get their hands on it. So my feeling is that it'll probably be a mix going forward, but there's definitely going to be a lot of more face-to-face going forward in terms of raising money.
Well, I think that's a great kickoff. Let's try to do this a standard way. Let's, try to start with a good tone, and then we move to challenges. So I personally never raised in the US. I raised 30 million in my lifetime, raised from Latin America and the Saudis. And I'll tell you the good part, and hopefully you share the same experience or not. Desperation was the key for me, and it did not matter where the money coming, but I needed to pay the bills. And what I noticed is that valuations weren't so important in that side, but the story that you told, that was the most important. So maybe we'll start with you, Andrew, again. Do you have any, positive feedback, or how was the experience different from raising across borders than traditionally?
Yeah, no, I think there's themes that you point to there that when you're raising money, that you need to have a great story, you need to be able to sell it, you need to tell your value convincingly. So practice obviously helps no matter where you're trying to invest. I think going across borders, it seems obvious, but sometimes we forget is that there's just cultural differences in how people interact, how people engage, but also in how people invest as well. When you go to the US, they have a very structured way of investing, typically with the types of terms that they want and the legal structure that they like. And if you're a European company going to the US, and you have, say, an Italian corporate structure, well, that's going to be very confusing to the US investor, right? So you've got to be cognizant of these nuances as you get into it, because they can become huge hurdles down the line, because then, what are you going to do? Change your whole corporate structure? And how long will that take you? And know that when you go to these places, the types of things that are going to come up, because you're going outside of your borders to track down funds.
Yeah, to Andrew's point, I think if you want to be international, it's probably better to start in the US and then raise from Europe. This direction probably makes more sense. At least it was very transparent in our case. Of course, there's these differences that the European investors tend to like smaller valuations and don't have necessarily the same expectations in terms of return on investment. But it seems to equalize in the U.S. sense. So everybody knows Delaware companies and C corps, and is more likely then to accept these terms. And when you work with a known brand legal firm out of Silicon Valley, and they say these are the standard terms, then it is very likely that the Canadian and European investors will just go with the flow. And so that's kind of what we've been doing, and that also helps with convincing these international investors that the valuation expectations are reasonable. We are a San Francisco company, and here these sorts of price points are more realistic.
Well, on our side, let's say that before our C-Series, we were a very French company. We only had French VCs, and let's also phrase it before closing the C-Series. Well, when you close it, you feel smart, you feel proud, and as if you would have had a clear strategy to reach this goal. This is not the reality. So when we started our round, we were talking to VCs, to strategic, and to the ones who wanted to listen to us and to hear our story. So we were talking with French VCs, European VCs, American VCs, strategics from Europe, from the US, and we also then talked with VCs in China and strategic in China. And that's the way everything happened. And then, well, we got one strategy which came to us and said, well, guys, but because by the way, we wanted to raise 15 million, and at the end we closed at 40. So we got a strategic which said, well, okay, I'm going to invest 40 million, and here are my conditions. And then in our mind it became the landmark, and we said, okay, well, we're gonna raise 40. Let's go for 40. So this is what we had in mind, and then we start to talk with the Chinese VCs, strategics, and at the end of the table we had 3 possibilities, and we selected the Chinese one with the biggest strategic in our specialty in China, and together we built a joint venture set up in Shanghai. That's the way it is.
Sure. So the first question we pose ourselves is, how do you know you actually have an interesting story and a good platform that appeals globally to everybody? And that's not an easy answer to have unless you test yourself out there. So of course, we have wonderful investors in Spain and in Europe, which is great. So we got a very relevant Series A. But then we wanted to go farther and put ourselves in the challenge of European investment calls. And these European investment calls have a 1% chance of success. So we knew that we had to be very good to get there. But we had worked extensively to actually perfectionate our vision, a vision also that the team buys and that they are ready to execute, and a vision that can be easily understood by the stakeholders that are on the other side. Luckily, we have been able to win all the European calls, the Pathfinder, the Transition, the Accelerator, to a total of 21 million euros, which has been a fantastic support. And then what we are doing as well is question ourselves, is that story resonating equally in the US? And we apply for the MedTech Innovator Accelerator, which is also quite competitive. It's only 5 to 6% acceptance rate. And at least we got into, and it's been a wonderful experience to have a platform to connect to the US stakeholders. And now, of course, we have to keep working to close Series B. And we are missing a lead investor, and we're working on that. But I'm confident that hopefully with our first in-human data, it's going to happen.
And I think the question you're asking was kind of what are the differences, if I was hearing correctly, what are the differences of raising in those different places? One thing that I think is fascinating, particularly when you look at raising money in Asia, is when you go into those discussions, the investors are rightfully going to be interested in how your technology applies in their market. And it's something that most people just don't think about, or they think about it in too broad a stroke. How many times have we heard people say, I'm first going to release my technology and sell it in America, then I'm going to do it in Europe, and then I'm going to sell it in Asia. And every time I hear that, I just think, you have got zero idea what you're talking about. The strategy of selling a product in Japan versus selling a product in Indonesia, you're going to put those two things together and going to say, I'm going to sell in Asia. And I think what's fantastic, the difference you find if you go and pitch to an Indonesian VC, is they say, tell me how this technology applies in Indonesia. And that's an amazing question to be asking yourself. It really opens up your eyes. Because, take radiotherapy, there's 325 million people in the US and about 5,000 machines. There are 280 million people in Indonesia, so not that different, but there's a handful of machines. So you've got to really come up with a solid answer to that question, to that Indonesian VC who says, why is your technology different? So I think that's a major difference. It's kind of the same question that they're asking, but it's a major difference when you go across those different countries. It's been fascinating for me.
So this leads me to ask you, do you think that there is a moment where it's too early? You were talking about getting prepared for, pitching to an international panel of investors. But in terms of amount or phasing of the companies, do you think that there is a certain threshold below which it's better not to focus on, let's say, going across the border?
So I can speak from my experience. Maybe it is at some point, but I also am learning that developing those relationships is even more important than be at the right spot to get the investment. I think that it's very important for both parties to know each other and to understand personalities, way of working, way of delivering before engaging into a long-term relationship, if possible. So building and knowing the people behind all these investments for me has been key. Also because when we are all at the board, you want the best possible combination of those personalities, those knowledge, and a constructive spirit to be successful. So to me, it's never too early. For others, maybe I think it's a waste of time sometimes, but I really value it.
I think it depends on the CEO and how much kind of they're relying on those investors to give them guidance and help them build the business. But I agree with you that those, that fostering those relationships is important and do it early. And I also think exactly what I was saying there about how does your technology apply in those markets. Getting connected to those investors will open you up to potential customers, to distributors, to other people that will be important in that journey of you bringing your technology into further afield markets. And you might find out through those discussions that there's something that needs to be integrated in your product. You need to develop it in a different way. And the earlier you find that information out, the better.
Yeah, I certainly see a scheme here, and I hear Stephen and Lucian and others explain how there's a relationship between the investors and their go-to-market. And so you, Lucian, for example, you explained that there is a strategic investor from China, there was VCs from China, and you have a clear goal to actually penetrate the Chinese market. You have a partnership and a joint venture over there. So I think it makes sense for such companies that have a really clear ambition to go international soon and to have, right from the start, a global vision, as compared to companies that may really be US-centered or European-centered. For them, it may not make a lot of sense to go and reach out to international VCs right from the start. But I think for these sorts of companies like we are, it is a natural choice. And these VCs, they, as we hear all the time in other panels at this conference also, we want VCs not only to provide capital, but also provide opportunities to help in business development, in networking, in relationships, in regulatory concerns, through their portfolio companies, through their partnerships. And that is essentially important, specifically when talking about global investors coming into the cap table.
I actually want to stay in this topic, and I know Andy and Lucian, you guys have great stories. Relationship is key. But this is across borders. One, you raise without seeing the person. Two, you use a broker or an agency. And I'll be honest, I raised back home. It was just easier. The question is, how do we build relationships? And another one is, you're mentioning, we don't need to go to traditional paths when you're cross borders. Can we look at distributors? Can we look at other sources? What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, relationships is always a challenge across borders. I think, now that things have opened up, you got to do your best to try and see people in person. I think it makes a big difference. During COVID times, people were quite understanding of it, but I think it helps smooth things tremendously. In terms of like alternative sources like dealers and whatnot, there's tons of money out there. But I think, as I say often to people trying to look for money, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Is it going to end up being worth your time, effort, and energy to go get it? In our process, we actually got several term sheets from China as we were raising, and we spent a lot of time with complicated licensing deals to work with China. But, it had to be part of the strategy. We had to see the value in going to China. And, there's a lot of great statistics from China. A third of the world's smokers are Chinese men, right? There's a lot of cardiovascular disease there. It is a huge market. They have 70 million people with aortic valve disease, you know, so it's a huge market for us to address. But what, you know, so we saw that as part of the long-term plan. I wouldn't go to China if you're just looking for money and don't see that as part of your story long-term. But, you know, and then, you know, you got to go and you got to be prepared. Looking for other sources, I mean, there are dealers that'll put in money, as you mentioned. There are other, but what does it lead to is I guess would be the question you have to think about in these different markets. So I would keep that in your mind as you kind of think about it. Well, you know, should we go to Latin America or Saudi? And you know, we got phone calls from even Dubai, but it was one of these things of, you know, how are we going to make this happen? How are we going to build a relationship there? And is it going to be worth our time, effort, and energy? Because at the end of the day, you need to get money, and you got to keep the company going in the direction. And is it worth all the time that you have to commit to make that happen? That's a critical question you got to answer.
So you're talking about relationship before or after his investment? Before his investment?
Before.
So before his investment, in our case, I personally knew already the executive VP of the company, of the Chinese company, Microport, beforehand since years. So we knew each other's, and by pure coincidence, it happened that I was taking this new job and same space, and then we start discussion. So we had already a relationship, but we didn't have the relationship with the VCs from China. So we took a third party. I guess we mentioned in their name already. I don't know if it was yesterday or today with Mavi, as are quite well specialized in putting in relationship companies from Europe and together in touch with Chinese investors. So this is how it happened, actually. This is how we created the relationship between us and the Chinese investors, and also with the strategic. This is how it happened. And now, once the investment is done, because in our case, the investors from China were not expecting just to give us money to continue to develop our company or our technology. But they were also expecting that we would build up together a structure in China. It happened afterwards, not before. So this is how it happened that we built up together as a joint venture, and now it's a broader story that we have to build up the relationship, trust, work together, different culture, different way of working, of developing things, and so on and so forth. So this is something that should be known beforehand, because you need to be prepared for that. You need to have the resources to work and to cope with the Chinese company.
Yeah, one additional thing, and this relates more to the after the fundraising journey, but or during the total course of the raise of the company. When you raise from international investors, you will end up having a board that is consisting of people from different countries around the world. I'm not sure whether it's true for you, but it's true for us. And so we have a board member from Finland, one from Belgium, one from Canada, and two from California. And so we have never come together in person as a board. So all the board meetings have been in virtual, and that's something which is also unique, I suppose. So you need to deal with these significant time zone differences, and with the fact that you're missing out on this directly coming together and this bonding energy potentially.
Carolina, being a worldwide person, does it make it easier to raise across borders? Being a worldwide person, you're from Spain, your business in Switzerland, you're in America all the time. I've probably seen you 3 or 4 times this year. Does it make it easier to being a worldwide person?
Look, I always work in global roles. Since my Medtronic times for 13 years, I was global. That's why I moved to Switzerland to be at the European headquarters, but then took global roles. And I always thought that you could never do business from your chair at home, right? Like, you have to be where the action is, where the people are. You have to understand what's behind these people, what are their drivers, how to make this happen, and therefore you have to be there. You also have to be effective, so you cannot be everywhere. So you have to prioritize and choose your battles and have a clear strategic roadmap about where you go each time and why, and what is the value that you are going to bring back. Because at the end, the world is very big, right? And you can get lost very easily. So it's very important, and I learned it since all these years I've been global, that there's a few battles you choose and you focus, but you deeply understand them so they can be successful. And that's how I run my businesses globally, and that's how I'm doing with this company.
Stephen, so how do you create roots? Like, you raised across everywhere in the world. In the end of the day, does it become just transactional? Can you actually create something more meaningful?
And maybe, Stephen, also if you can tell a little bit more about your ability to raise among different type of investors across the border, like distribution companies, that to me was quite impressive.
Yeah, so I think it comes back down to the kind of the starting question, the strategy. Why do it? And it's not just kind of because the money was there. For me, as a first-time founder, and I never raised money, I didn't even know what venture capital was until about 4 years ago. So I had no idea what I was doing. And I kind of looked at lots of different investment principles. And if you're investing your own money, what you would do is you try and diversify your portfolio to reduce your risk. You wouldn't put every single dollar that you had in oil and gas. You try and diversify what you're doing when you're putting your money out there. And I took the same approach, and I thought the same thing would apply when you're raising money. And that's from different categories of investors, so strategics, family offices, VCs, distributors, all kinds of places like that. Very, very varied in terms of the type of investor, and then geography as well. Try and be really, really broad with your geography, because then if there's an economic downturn in the US, but you've got a bunch of investors that are in Singapore, go back and raise your next round of capital in Singapore. Now, it just so happened that COVID came along and there was a global epidemic and everybody had an economic downturn. So the rationale is a little bit flawed in that sense, but that was kind of the thought process. And then in terms of building those relationships and how do you do it and how can you do it, I think, as I said yesterday, the key to building relationships, good relationships, is to focus on what can I do for you. Too many people go and they just pitch and don't even think about the person they're pitching to as a person. It's always just about, I need money, I'm trying to raise money, I'm coming to you and I'm asking for money. What can you give to me? I think the key to building good relationships across the board is to ask yourself, what can I do for you?
But you did something differently. You moved from the UK to California, and you lived there, and you showed commitment. How was that?
Yeah, again, it was kind of more luck than judgment, if I'm totally honest. Again, as a first-time founder, not knowing what I was doing, there's some fantastic people up here that have got tons of experience. For me, when I decided I needed to raise money, I just Googled top 10 MedTech investors in the world, and a few of them are in California. So I thought, well, I've got no kids at that time, and why not? Packed up my bags. California's pretty sunny. And moved over there and built that network by just going and bugging people, and whoever would listen to me, I'd talk to them, and went from there. But you've, like you said, you've got to be there in the action. You've got to be with the people. Relationships are really difficult to do over email. You've got to be there. You've got to spend those evenings having dinner with people. That's how you build relationships.
I guess just to start packing it up, just to leave like education nuggets, let's play devil's advocate, starting with Andy. What is something that people should think about in terms of like why not raise across borders?
Well, yeah, so I think with any money you take in, you have to understand what you're dealing with. And sometimes you can get investors who aren't really committed to your long-term vision. So sometimes I think I've seen companies so desperate to take money, they bring in some money that, yeah, it helps short-term, but then long-term they're not willing to put in more money, or they become a difficult investor or that you have to spend a lot of time with. And then there may be cultural issues. I think yesterday someone brought up that, a lot of the European VCs tend to be bankers, right? And so and they have kind of a different approach and mentality to how the money they bring in, whereas, other investors tend not to have that. So I think you have to always consider in the money, like before you take it in, what is it going to mean for us long term? Are we willing to commit to this? In China, for example, they want the rights to your technology in China often. Well, you're signing yourself up to a tech transfer, you're signing yourself up to a commitment, you're signing yourself up to a partner, and it's a marriage, and can you deal with that? Because it could be a huge headache down the line, and a lot of those partnerships blow up in an acrimonious way. Are you prepared for that, right? And I think sometimes people just jump in, yeah, we'll get the money and we'll figure it out, but you have to understand the consequences of all the money you take in and make sure you appreciate it culturally, structurally, et cetera, as a part of your raise.
Culturally, structurally, but also legally. So, for example, if you're a US company and you do anything that's of national concern in any way, even if it's just encrypted, say, data, or anything that can be used by the armed forces or anything like that, then it will fall under what's called the CFIUS regulation in the United States, and you should be very careful in terms of foreign control you have on your cap table. And so you need to consult with your legal firm actually to see whether this is permissible, and who the investors are and who the LPs are in your investment funds. So to be safe, not to be forced into any significant transactions later on.
I would say, just to add, I agree with all what I heard so far. So I would add that once you start, considering cross-border investment, you should ask yourself, if I will take that route, am I going to be consistent with my story for the next round? Or what will be my next story for the next round? What is the value? What is the values that I'm going to create by going through that route? All this kind of consideration. Am I going to keep all doors open for the next steps? If so, go for it.
Yeah, pretty much the same. Know what are you getting yourself into, knowing the rules of what that entails, taking that money from that particular location. I was recently in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and sometimes it's very appealing. There's a lot of money, but I've been doing business in Saudi Arabia, and right now we wouldn't be ready probably. In the future for sure, but you have to know what are the commitments you have to deliver on, and because it's much worse to not deliver. I mean, you destroy all the value that you have created with that round. So basically, understand the path.
I definitely agree with all of those things. Just something that may be more tangible to add on to the top of all of that. You don't get much sleep as a startup CEO anyway, especially, and looking at you, Giovanni, especially when you've got a young kid as well. That's certainly a challenge to add into that. But then think about, investors want to talk to you. If you've got investors that are in California, that are in Europe, and then are over in Asia, they're not going to be the ones that are awake at 2 a.m. to take the call, I can tell you that. So, you've got to communicate with people in a lot more time zones, and that's a challenge. If you've got an international board like we do from California, Europe, and Singapore, then your board meetings are really pretty difficult to arrange, just time zone wise. So again, you can pretty much guarantee you're the one that's awake at 2 a.m. taking the board meeting. So overall, I think it's worth it. It gives you a huge amount of opportunities, and you're international from day one. But there are definitely some considerations.
Well, all right. So this is it. I would like really to thank you guys for sharing all your experience. It was tremendous. And please give a round of applause for these panelists.